Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our second session of the AI Ethics, Risk and Compliance short course with IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. My name is Jack Stewart, and we are joined by Lily Nguyen, who is managing everything, making sure it all runs smoothly, and our wonderful mentor, Dr. George Thomas, who, as we mentioned last week, is a veteran of various kinds of AI, cybersecurity, and other types of interesting IT work all around the world, as well as a repeat Microsoft MVP. For our second webinar as well, we acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders and ancestors and acknowledge their ongoing connections to land, waters, and culture. Today is the second of 4 installments in this series of series of webinars for this short course. So, as usual, the recording from this will be posted on YouTube and on the student portal within 24 hours of the webinar concluding, as well as on that student portal. So that's learn.itmasters.edu.au. That is where you can find your course materials, quizzes, and forums, which hopefully everyone has been engaging with. And if not, hopefully everyone will engage with. That is where you can ask lots of questions and engage in spirited discussions with your fellow participants, as well as our mentor. Last week, judging by the immense number of questions that we had in the Q&A, I imagine there were a lot of forum posts and responses and things like that. So hopefully we keep that up. The forum is also where you can find the quizzes and things like that, which are not currently uploaded, I don't believe, or things like surveys, but will be uploaded in the coming weeks, as well as where you will be able to access your exam after the final webinar in this series has concluded. That exam will be, as usual, you will have 1 hour to complete it. You don't need to complete it at any particular time, but when you do successfully complete that exam, you will have a certificate, which is really nice to have. And also, successful completion of this short course does count towards the 3 short course completions as 1 subject credit for recognition of prior learning for a full-length graduate certificate or master's with IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. So if you're interested in studying a full-length course with us, definitely keep that in mind. Always nice to be able to reduce the time and financial commitment necessary to get yourself a postgrad qualification. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get properly started. As usual, please use the chat to make observations or to address, questions, concerns, etc. for your fellow participants. Just any information or interesting tidbits that you would like to share. And usually we manage to keep a good eye on the Q&A. The Q&A section is for questions directly related to the course content to be asked to George. So we will do our very best to answer as many questions as we can, but we do have limited time. So apologies if we're not able to get to your question, but that is very much what those forums on the learn.itmasters.edu.au portal are for. So please do make good use of those. We will endeavour to get to as many questions as we can within time. We should finish up at around 8:30 or slightly earlier than that. And again, if you've got any questions for Lily or the short courses administration team, feel free to email shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au as well. And our wonderful team will be able to hopefully sort you out for that. So I'd say that is probably the end of our housekeeping for today. So welcome to the second session of this AI Ethics, Risk and Compliance short course. And now I'll hand over to our mentor, Dr. George Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate that. And thanks for the intro. I actually have a question which is so as part of doing the this course and getting the certificate and you get the credit. What does that sort of count towards? Is that like the grad cert and applied AI type courses, or is there like a specific course that it would give you credit for? Do you know?
That's a really good question. Usually, any of the courses that are eligible to put towards that three short courses completion, there are a number of subjects that can be used that can be used as credit towards. So it depends on which courses those subjects are related to.
Mm,
I would say for this one that it would absolutely be included or eligible in the cybersecurity, in the cloud computing and virtualization courses, networking and sysadmin. Not 100% sure on all of those, but it could be used in. Oh, Lily's very helpfully added a link in the chat. Can be used as credit in any of those courses. So we'll sit in the Group B elective group is the that list of subjects that it is eligible towards. So that's handy.
good to
And
know.
yes, and just to answer a quick question that's been asked in the Q&A, the course materials are all available at learn.itmasters.edu.au. There are not assignments for this course specifically. There will be an exam at the end of the course. All right, over to you, George.
Thanks very much. And another point on the course materials. So I think there's been a few questions about like study guides. And so in other courses, like for example, I've run the one of the CISSP courses. I've also run, I think, the Security Plus course last year. And those particular courses, given that they're like certification style prep courses, have study guides. So in this particular short course, there's no, I guess, prescribed study guide for that. I mean, this is a, I guess, fairly bespoke course. Having said that, what I will direct you to, if you haven't had um, a chance or if you haven't seen it, is at the bottom of each of these decks, there's like a reference list that links to where, and I know it's not a study guide, but it does link to a lot of the content that's been referred to within within the presentations. So, if you look at, tonight we'll talk about, GRC and sorry, GRC and AI. There's going to be, references to that. There's going to be, things around the sort of EU AI Act that will be, there'll be links directly to that. Obviously, you could go find them yourself, but, to kind of save a bit of time and for, in terms of relevance, you can just refer to the bottom of each of the presentations and get the get some, some reading material from there. Reading material is what I was looking for. Anyway, I had better get moving. So, welcome back. Welcome to the second week in this 4 week, I guess, series on AI, ethics, risk, and compliance. So last week we talked about, foundations of responsible AI, which was, very sort of introductory in terms of, some of the terminology and the types of AI and things like that. Um, Tonight, we will be covering off governance, risk, and compliance, so GRC in AI. Um, and I do have see, you're okay with my next clicking. Um, Grayed out. Next one. And so, yeah, we'll cover off what that is and look at, I guess, some of the, sort of standards and frameworks that will, that can apply to AI. And then, look at the sort of GRC elements. So, I guess without further ado, I'll move forward. And as I said last week, because I just love doing this, I always start with a definition of something, just for anybody that may not be familiar with a concept. I usually start at the very beginning. So first couple of slides is a bit of background on GRC. So what is GRC? So this is a definition that came from Diligent. Now, GRC is a system that organizations use to structure governance, risk management, and regulatory compliance. Um, it is a concept. So the concept is to unify an organization's approach to risk management and regulatory compliance. Strengthening and rationalizing these processes can help improve business performance and enhance decision making within corporate governance boards. GRC is very broad. And so, GRC isn't a it's not specific. It's a concept that can be applied to many different areas, and we'll look at what some of those areas are in a moment, just as some examples. Obviously, AI is one of them, but there may be some other areas that you are, that you're familiar with that you've seen before. So if I little diagrams, if you look at what governance, risk, and compliance are, so governance is really that, how or, or how an organization is directed and controlled and what those sort of requirements are. So, this is that kind of almost oversight piece in terms of things like policies, things like frameworks, those rules effectively come from that governance level. And so when you think about, developing, I guess, governance strategies, you're going to refer to those types of artifacts. You're going to look at what policies an organization has, what rules they need to abide by. And yeah, that whole, it's going to sound weird, but that governing process is the sort of the G, the governance. Risk is really focused around risk management. So what is risk? Again, it depends. I've tried to keep a very broad definition here, which is an event that could harm or impact an organization's ability to achieve its objectives. For example, and I've done a lot in the cyber GRC space, their definition is what's the ISO one? Um, it's kind of around, the sort of uncertainty around objectives and things like that. So anything that can impact that. Risks can be, and I think I've spoken about this in other sessions, like risk can be positive or negative. But really, the sort of crux of it is it's about things that are uncertain, and it's about things that can have impact to an organization. And so that's risk. And so it's obviously very important to identify those risks and understand what those risks are so that they can then be, mitigated in some way. So whether that be, through the use of controls, whether that be through the use of, avoiding the risk, sharing the risk, all those sorts of things. So there's different ways to look at that and how that's addressed. And then finally, we have the compliance piece. So this is about complying with the rules that are set out earlier, as well as complying with things like relevant legislation and regulation. So this is where, regulators and laws will come into play. So you can kind of see how it fits together, and there's kind of that almost bouncy ball of, you've got these rules that are set and this oversight from a governance perspective. You've got this compliance piece at the other end, which is making sure there's, compliance with those rules and with those policies and so forth. But also, if you look at risk, there's these elements that can potentially threaten that and threaten the operations and the, the sort of ongoing viability of an organization. So all these things together, need to be managed. And this is where GRC is important. And obviously, I'm going to start to try and direct the conversation more from a less generic perspective over to AI. But before I do that, what are some examples of GRC within an organization? And so one that's, really common, and this is, I think, where the Diligent one came by, and I think Diligent do like, like sort of software and platforms that are used by boards and so forth. But, corporate strategy and governance risk. So this is about, aligning business strategy with governance, things like organizational structure and, decision making. That's corporate strategy and governance. We've got human resources, so that's around things like, employee engagement, internal comms, policies and procedures related to the HR functions or whatnot. I won't walk through every single one of those. ESG is a big one, so things around sustainability, social responsibility within an organization. As we start to move over now, probably getting a little bit more relevant, IT and cybersecurity, which is going to be very relevant from an AI perspective as well. So things like IT risk management, data protection, and privacy will really fall into this IT and cybersecurity sort of, I guess, basket. And this helps to, I guess, manage those risks associated with things like digital transformations, like technology, like AI. So that's, I guess, if you're going to put it into a bit of a category, it's probably going to align most closely with IT and cybersecurity. Having said that, I think it's also important that there's a whole set of GRC, I guess, elements that will reside outside of that. And obviously, well, not obviously, but often these two types will complement each other. So, from an AI GRC perspective, you're going to have things like governance around, the sort of AI risk, AI models, and so forth. Whereas you're also going to have that overlay of IT and cyber related risks because obviously AI sits on top of that. So possible applications to of GRC to AI. So we can apply again these same concepts to artificial intelligence. And so things like, as I mentioned literally just before, AI model governance. So, things like the ability to explain the models, that sort of documentation, versioning, all that sort of stuff might be an example of AI model governance. AI risk management, I mean, that's going to be a big one. So, things like bias in models, things like attacks, misuse, non-compliance with particular, legislation or regulation. If there's going to, potentially be a risk of a data breach because you've got PI in there, all those sorts of things will sit within AI risk management, and then again apply controls to I guess mitigate those particular threats. And then finally, looking at AI compliance, which will happen as a result of mitigating a lot of those risks, you would think. But aligning to frameworks like ISO 42001, NIST AI risk management framework, etc. So there's also things like ethical AI and responsible innovation, all that sort of stuff, fairness, bias, all that can also be possible applications. So, why is GRC critical to AI? I think the crux of it is, well, AI is pretty unique. Um, so there are some really unique challenges within AI. There's going to be things like, as it says there, opacity, autonomy, and scalability that are going to be different. With AI, the AI is for the large part going to have a lot of autonomy. It's going to do things and make decisions and provide outputs in an automated fashion. So it's really important that those sort of risks have been identified again, that there's compliance, that they're effectively governed. There's going to be ethical concerns. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of what we're talking about for the last week and the next sort of 3 weeks or 2, 3 weeks. So there's going to be ethical consideration. So again, looking at that sort of risk element, looking at what the sort of ethical risks are, again, making sure that it's compliant with regulation, legislation. That's going to be a critical piece of GRC. So, what we're going to do is, look at some key frameworks in supporting GRC in AI. And we will talk about some of the, it says there's some complex compliance requirements. So some that are AI specific, and we're going to cover off some of those in a moment. There's also some more broader ones like, privacy and cybersecurity, but again, it's quite a tricky one because AI can touch many parts of an organization, and often it will probably touch almost every part of an organization. And it will have, it's not just one particular area or one particular set of laws. Generally, it's many. So identifying those and making sure that all of that is managed is going to be crucial. So, what are some, and not exhaustive, but some key frameworks, standards that are around the place? So, we have ISO 42001, so ISO IEC 42001, which is the Artificial Intelligence Management System standard. And by the way, I'm going to dig into each one of these in a bit more detail in the following slides. We have the OECD AI principles, and that's been around for quite some time. Again, I'll get into these in a bit more detail. One that many probably heard of as well, which is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, or the RMF. We also have the EU AI Act, and we'll go for a brief overview of that. And there's also some others that I haven't included here, but there's also industry has provided some guidance as well. So, for example, Microsoft, Google, IBM, they've all got some, I guess, guidance on how to sort of responsibly use AI. So it's worthwhile checking those out as well. But we'd be here all night if we went through every example. So I've used the ones that are kind of a bit more broad and non-vendor specific, I guess is probably a good way to look at it. So let's start with this one. I'm not going to go too deep in this today because next week we are literally going to focus on this. And there's a reason why I've chosen to focus on 42001 and ISO. And it's not because I just like do a lot of ISO stuff. It's more because it's a management system. And I'll kind of explain a bit later on how a lot of these can almost operate with each other. So ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. I know that's IOS, but anyway. So, it's an internationally recognized body, I guess, who publish a very large number of standards, like a large number. May be familiar with 27001, so ISO 27001 for anyone that's worked in quality, 9001, anyone that's worked in, with OH&S, 45001. There's, a huge amount. Some of them are certifiable, some of them aren't. This happens to be one that is certifiable, and it is the first international standard specifically designed for managing AI within organizations. And it can be applied to any organization. I mean, literally any, but I mean, typically the ones that are going to develop or use AI. And what it does is it establishes a framework for managing artificial intelligence, which is why, as you can see in the standard name, so that first bullet point is the actual name of the standard. So it's Information Technology Artificial Intelligence Management System, or it's referred to as an AIMS. So if anyone that's worked in, the security field and worked with 27, you'll know that's the ISMS. If you've worked with 27701, which is the privacy one, that's the PIMS, PIMS, which I think is a drink also. Maybe the drink has an extra M. And with this one, this is the AIMS. So this is the AI management system. And what it does is it helps, organizations to, develop, deploy, and use AI systems in a responsible, ethical, and transparent way. It was published in, 2023, and it will follow. And as I said, I'm almost done because I won't go too deep. It follows a high-level structure, and why that's important is because that's how the ISO systems or the management systems are all structured. So they all have this high level structure. So, sort of clauses 5 to 10, and they're all almost the same. And so they fit very well with each other. It also has annexes like 27001 does. And it is certifiable. So you can get a, external auditor to come in and certify your aims against the 42001 standard and get a certificate and I don't know, show everybody. So yeah. Anyway, I'll keep going. One other important thing is it does follow that plan, do, check, act life cycle. But again, I will cover the details of the PDCA and 42001 in a lot more detail next week. So it's a bit more of a deep dive into that. Um, so the OECD principles. So, this is for trustworthy AI. It was sort of adopted in 2019, and it has these 5 principles for trustworthy AI. So the first one is inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. So this is about AI benefiting, people, promoting, and the planet, promoting, things that are human-centered outcomes and making sure that there is equality and environmental sustainability. So that's what the first one is about. The second one is about law, human rights, privacy, fairness, freedom of bias, all those sorts of things, transparency and explainability. And I know we touched a little bit on these last week, but AI actors should make sure that there's transparency in the systems. And so, and that includes things around decision making and limitations. We also have robustness, security, and safety. And I think I saw something pop up in the chat last week briefly asking about security. Um, we will get into a bit more detail, but I think AI is a complex area because there's a lot to it. But absolutely, just to answer that question, um, security is definitely one of those key things that needs to be considered. And when you look at risks, there are certainly going to be cyber risks that appear that need to be mitigated, and that's where the sort of security controls come in place. And certainly in 42001, we'll get into a bit more detail in that. So next week. And then accountability. So, who is accountable for these functions, and who's responsible for oversight and all those sorts of things. Um, cool. Now, we also have NIST. So NIST, who is NIST? So NIST, it's funny because normally in a normal webinar that I want to go, someone tell me. But I don't normally have this many people in one webinar. So NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It is it's in the logo, look at that. It's a US Department of Commerce, um, I guess, function or department. And what they do is they publish a lot of standards. Um, in fact, when I was, uh, teaching my class last week on cyber warfare, I talked about, one of the attacks that had, it wasn't even an attack, it was almost like a simulation that had happened back in the 90s. And, as a result of this simulation and the demonstration of the gaps in the security posture of a, particular US government agency, that things like the special publications, all the NIST documents start with special publication basically. um, you know 853 was introduced. Anyway, that was in the 90s, like 96, 97. So now, in 2023 we have the AI risk management framework. So I think, look, similar format if you look at it in terms of, the cybersecurity framework that's been around for probably a bit over a decade now. Um, and what's interesting about this particular framework, like the CSF, if you've got that, is it is voluntary, it is flexible, and it's technology neutral. And so, what the intent of the risk management framework is about, supporting trustworthy AI. But what it does allow is alignment with things like existing standards and regulatory efforts. So it follows a similar approach to, again, if anyone's familiar with the cyber, the cyber, I guess, approach of, identify, detect, protect, respond, recover. Did I miss one? But anyway, it has a sort of similar approach with govern, map, measure, and manage. So govern, again, is about establishing oversight, policies, and those accountability structures. This is where you define roles, responsibilities, and things like escalation paths. Mapping is about understanding the sort of AI's sort of stakeholders, things like potential risks, any, technical or ethical concerns, things around, data sources and sort of issue or limits with models. That's going to be in map. And then you go down to measure, which is about quantifying risk, also around performance management, performance evaluation, things like, reliability will go into measure. And then finally, manage is about the controls. So it's about implementing controls, about monitoring the result of those controls and any response to things like incidents. And so that's the sort of cycle that follows there. So you could see that map, measure, and manage on the outside. And if you didn't wonder where the fourth one was, it's in the middle. So you've got govern that sort of overarches everything. So that is the NIST risk management framework. Um, let's move over to a piece of regulation, which is the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. Now, this came into effect almost a year ago. There is still, I think, a bit more kind of going on. Like, it's not fully in. But basically, what this is, it was the first piece of comprehensive AI regulation. So you'll see there's been a few firsts here. We've got the first standard in 42,001. We've got the first piece of comprehensive AI regulation that's in here. It also uses a risk-based approach to regulate the entire AI lifecycle. And what it's designed to do is to ensure that the use of AI is safe, transparent, and again, ethical. Um, but what's interesting about this is the sort of scope. So it looks at the EU, and it looks at those that develop, deploy, or distribute or import AI systems um, to the EU market. the key thing here is the what's the word? It's not the wish. The scope extends to those that are outside the EU as well. So if you're an organization within the EU that's, working with AI, then yes, you absolutely have to comply with this regulation. But also, if you're outside the EU, but you're providing effectively that AI to those within the EU, then you also need to comply with this regulation. And so, what's the point of the pyramid here? So, when looking at the risk-based approach, there are four risk levels that an AI system will fall into. So, as you go through and do the risk analysis and the risk assessment, you're going to come to well, hopefully a conclusion that it's going to be a unacceptable risk system, a high risk system, a limited risk system, or it's going to pose minimal risk. And so if you look at a unacceptable risk system, which is the red up the top, these cannot be used in the EU and they're just banned, basically. So this is going to be things like manipulation or sort of subliminal messages using AI. That would be a completely prohibited system. Anything that would exploit the vulnerabilities of people, so whether that's exploiting someone by age or disability or gender or whatnot, that would be a prohibited AI system. In terms of high risk AI systems, things like credit scoring, biometric identification, anything that's used for law enforcement, healthcare, employment, all of those systems are going to fall into high risk AI systems um, category. Now, they're not banned, but there's strict requirements that need to be complied with. And so that is effective risk management, effective data governance, things around transparency, and human oversight, all those things you've been hearing from me for the past week and a bit. Those are the things that need to be included to use those particular systems. So, and then you need to do conformity assessments and document that to say, yes, we are conforming with the requirements of the EU AI Act in order to use that. Um, so low risk systems, they must comply with transparency. So this is going to be things like chatbots and stuff like that. And even deep fakes would typically, unless they're going to do something like, for example, exploit vulnerabilities, which was up in the banned level there. Something like a deep fake, like maybe like the thing like what was that app we used to be able to like superimpose your face on stuff and like do a dance or whatever, that sort of stuff, or just those sorts of things. They are able to be used, but the user must be informed that they're interacting with AI. So there's going to be some transparency requirements around that. And then finally, down the bottom, you've got the no risk AI systems, which have no specific requirements, but voluntary, codes of conduct, for example, should be used. And that's going to be things like, spam filters, AI in video games, those things. They're basically not regulated, but, there should still be some, controls put in place for that. So as far as timelines go, as I said, it's not completely implemented yet. Start of this year, the unacceptable risk AI stuff was implemented, so that's in place. The high risk obligations, they take effect, or they took effect last month, no, month before, August. So, and then, oh no, sorry, no, next year, August, next year, not last month. So the high risk AI obligations will take effect in a year or just under a year. And then the sector specific stuff, so things like, medical devices and so forth, they will apply the following year, so 2027. Um, Now, I've talked about the EU and I've talked about the EU a lot. Probably wondering, what about Australia? I know we've got, folks from all over the world here. But I know we do have, quite a lot in this group from Australia. We do not yet have AI regulation. As I mentioned last week, I have seen reports where, it may not go ahead. So I think watch this space. But yeah, there's an article on the ACS where they're talking about whether the AI regulations in Australia will actually happen and maybe not. So yeah, we've got kind of nothing at the moment. Um, and then yeah, we'll talk later on tonight about what we do have. I did touch on it last week as well with the voluntary AI safety standards. We'll do a bit more of a deep dive into that tonight. So this is a bit like drinking from the fire hose. So I've, kind of gone through four different um, sort of, I guess, frameworks. I mean, one of them is a piece of legislation, but anyway, I guess the reason I bring it up is because, a lot of the time the EU have known to sort of set the gold standard for certain things. Certainly, that was I guess the widely accepted view for the GDPR. And then similar, they were, as I said, kind of, first for binding regulation for AI. So just to summarize this particular section, let's put them side by side. So if you want to compare, here we go. So if you look at the OECD AI principles, they're non-binding, so you can choose to adopt or not to adopt them. They do have global scope, and you can see here what the key principles are. So they're really about that, it's a really principles-based approach around, growth, well-being, fairness, etc. Um, ISO, international standard, certifiable. In fact, it's like the only one that is certifiable. And the scope of that is management systems. So within an organization, having an AI management system, and the focus of that is really around GRC. So it's that governance risk compliance element. It will use a risk-based approach. As you'll see, the other two also use a risk-based approach. And then, yeah, it will talk about things like, leadership and planning, support. So do you have the right resources to support? It's really about that management and building out an AI program to manage AI within an organization. The EU AI Act, it's binding regulation, so it's different. So far we've got OECD, ISO, and NIST that are all voluntary. However, with the EU AI Act, if you're within the scope of that act, so as I said, you're developing, providing, importing AI to to the EU, no matter whether you're in the EU or not, then it's binding regulation. You need to comply with it. As I said, it's a risk-based approach. And then finally, you've got the NIST AI risk management framework. So um, yeah, again, voluntary, does have that life cycle, is risk-based. There's actually a second page to this. Um, is that the same? No. And yeah, you can choose whether or not you want to apply that. I will get into because I'm sure one of the questions is going to be, which one do I do? I think the EU one's maybe a bit obvious, but the other three, where do I sort of sit? And I'm going to throw a couple more in there in a moment just to make things a little bit less clear, maybe. So in terms of the rest of the table, so you could see here that the only one that is certifiable is ISO that I've said. Um, and you can see also down the bottom, I think a key thing is around enforcement. So OECD, there's no enforcement. I mean, it's completely um, voluntary. AI risk management framework, again, no enforcement because it's completely voluntary. The ISO one, I mean, it says enforcement through a certification body, but that's not like enforcement, you're going to get in trouble sort of thing and get fined. That's more so that you run the risk of losing the certification if you don't comply with the standard after either not receiving it in the first place or not retaining it. That's what that means by enforcement, and that's the certification body's responsibility. The one that does have significant penalties will be the EU AI Act. So 7% of turnover or fines up to 3.5 million euro, whichever is greater. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no fines anywhere else. As I mentioned before, there are other certain pieces of regulation and legislation that would still need to be complied with regardless. So, as I said, the Privacy Act is a big one, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But, for breaches of privacy, whether or not, well, obviously, it doesn't matter if it's AI. If you know if you've got personally identifiable information or personal information within a AI system, and there's a breach, and there's, for example, serious harm, then you could be subject to penalties. So just because there's only one here that sort of says there's a enforcement action doesn't mean that there's no enforcement action through other pieces of legislation regulation. So it's really important. Again, it highlights the importance of GRC to understand what is actually required and what you may be subject to, and that that risk is adequately managed. So, all right, one moment. I'm just going to have a drink. Okay. So in Australia, we have the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. Um, you know, so we've looked at some well-known ones before, so here's some local standard guidance. Uh, I quite like the VAISS, and I'm also going to look at some of the guidance from the OAIC in a moment. I quite like these because they're quite easy to digest and the steps are pretty actionable. The intent of these, and it says it in that third bullet point there, they were designed to become mandatory, but not really sure what's happening there at the moment. But again, it would be prudent to look at these and to decide whether they should be adopted in your organizations if you're going to be, developing or consuming or using AI. So this was announced a year ago when these came out. So this is following. So last week we talked probably more about the AI ethics principles that were from the Australian government. Um, this followed that. Um, and so I guess the intent of this was to keep Australian businesses who use AI safe and ensure AI is used in a transparent, responsible way. Um, and you know, I've got this little thing in the blue box, but what the intent was that the standard has 10 guardrails, and they were to help understand the benefits of AI, mitigate and manage the risks AI may pose to your business, promote ongoing action to check AI systems are fit for purpose, encourage accountability for AI deployment, use and impact. Oh, wait, deployment, use and impact, decide. Oh, that sounds really weird. Use and impact, decide which systems are critical or which systems may pose the highest level of risk or harm. Is that really poorly worded? I just read that really badly. Anyway, so I'm going to step through them quickly, ish. So we've got guardrail one. So this is establish, implement, and publish an accountability process, including governance, internal capability, and strategy for regulatory compliance. So, look, this is about things like having an owner for the AI use, having a strategy, any training that's needed within the organization. It's about having those processes in place. And so it's about doing that so that you can have safe and responsible AI. Um, by the way, I am going to get to kind of how this all potentially can fit together shortly. So, guardrail two, establish and implement a risk management process to identify and mitigate risks. Do you see a theme here? I see a theme. We're back to risk management. So this is about looking at the impact of AI, looking at that from a risk-based perspective, looking at things like the potential harms that it could cause. Again, you got to do things like keep stakeholders in mind. You're going to hear the word stakeholder a lot next week when I talk about ISO. Um, and then doing risk assessments. And not just doing one risk assessment, it's doing frequent risk assessments. I think, the term is going to be ongoing risk assessment. Now, that doesn't mean you do a risk assessment every day. This is going to be, and look, this is not prescriptive. You're also going to hear me say that a lot too next week. But it's not prescriptive. It's about determining when you should do risk assessments and doing the risk assessments. And that's based on need, right? So the organization, your organization, will determine how often you should do that. Should you do it once every year? Look, I would say at a bare minimum once every year, but every month, every quarter, every 6 months. It really depends. And it depends how often things change as well. So if you're in an environment that changes a lot, or if there's a lot of legislation that may be changing or coming in, then maybe you want to do them more often. But again, it's not like an instruction manual on how often you do them. It's just saying you should do them and you should make sure that they're up to date. And they're not just sitting around for, 12 months, um, or 2 years or 3 years. So that's guardrail two. Guardrail three, here we go. So this is about protection. So protecting AI systems and implementing data governance measures to manage data quality and provenance. So this is where things like privacy sit, things like cybersecurity sit. So if you look at cybersecurity controls, they would sit in guardrail three. So looking at how to protect AI systems. Um, and this is kind of feeding back into the risk piece. So if you look at things like what the risks are, what the risk profile is of the organization, they will determine what type of controls have to be put in place. So, for example, if you're in an organization that, yeah, collects personal information, let's say they collect sensitive personal information, then there's going to be a lot more risk around that information, and there's going to be a lot around making sure that that information is secured. And that might even be that it shouldn't be in the AI at all. That is one option. The other thing to sort of oh, what's my train of thought? What was I going to say? Oh, to add to that is how long came back. You need to hold on to that information. So that's where the data governance piece comes in. If you've collected it and you no longer need it, should you still have it? So, I know this sounds like I'm kind of talking sort of cyber language and data gov language, but yeah, all this stuff is very relevant to AI. Vulnerabilities will appear in here as well. So if there's any cyber vulnerabilities, that will appear in guardrail three. Guardrail four is about testing. So testing models to make sure that they're working basically. Make sure that they fit with those accountability processes, make sure that the use is responsible, and those sorts of things. That's guardrail four. So yeah, make sure those models are tested and that they're operating effectively. Um, Human control. So this is that human oversight piece, and we would have seen that in some of the, have you noticed a lot of this stuff is very, very similar. So human control, intervention, making sure that the AI, has that oversight so that, we're not just relying on, the algorithms to make the decisions and so forth. And we're really starting to now make sure we're helping reduce the unintended consequences and potential harm that may occur from just letting the system do its own thing. Guardrail 6. So, look, this is also, if you look at the EU AI Act, I talked about, making sure that people are aware that AI is being used. This is basically very similar. So inform end users regarding AI-enabled decisions, interactions, and AI and with AI and AI generated content. So this is also about creating trust. So creating trust with users, um, you know, basically disclosing when you're using AI, when that's used to make a decision or generate content. And again, it's again up to the organization to work out, how to do that. But yeah, make sure that that's something that's being done. So not hiding the fact that AI is being used. Establish processes for people impacted by AI to challenge user outcomes. So this is a process piece. So if there's a decision or an outcome that's caused from an interaction with AI, then there needs to be some way for someone to basically question that and not just be. And it's funny because if you look at the EU, when we talk about the high risk decisions, things like, credit decisions and so forth, that would be again where that type of thing would happen. There need to be um, a process to say, well, I disagree and, challenge it. And then obviously probably at that point have a human intervene and, sort of take over. Uh, be transparent with other organizations across the AI supply chain, data models, and systems to help them effectively address risk. Um, so this is about, when you're working with other organizations, making sure that the other organizations just understand how it was built, understand, things like risk of the use of the AI system. I'm just looking, I'm getting time. Guardrail 9, keep and maintain records to allow third parties to assess compliance with guardrails. And you saw earlier there was some requirements around like documentation and things like that. This is the same thing again. So maintaining records, making sure there's compliance, making sure there's an inventory, those sorts of things. And finally, at least in the VAIS, is engaging stakeholders and evaluating their needs and circumstances with a focus on safety, diversity, inclusion, and fairness. Um, so again, stakeholders is critical. Who's using the systems? Who's going to be affected by the systems? What are those potential harms? What are those potential real or unintended consequences? I know that's hard, but it needs to be done. So things like whether there could be a result of bias, um, all those sorts of things need to be identified, and then there needs to be some sort of work done to make sure that everything is fair and so forth. Um, Interestingly, as I said, next week you're going to hear me say the word stakeholder a lot because when looking at something like 42,001 or 27,001 or 9,001 for that matter, there's a big piece around understanding stakeholders or interested parties, and making sure that their needs and expectations and things like that as well. So that's a big part of that. And I think that's where and then the following week we kind of go through a case study that we sort of bring it all together. Now, as I said, in Australia, we don't have a AI, I guess, piece of regulation yet, but we do have other laws. We have the Privacy Act. Um, Another piece of really useful guidance that I've come across is the OAIC stuff. So I guess to wrap that up, well, not to wrap that up, to wrap up tonight, we'll kind of go through the OAIC stuff, and then I think we're going to go to questions. But effectively, there's two types of guidance or two sets of guidance that have come from the OAIC or the Privacy Commissioner, and that is privacy when developing and training Gen AI models, and privacy when using commercially available AI products. Interestingly, it does say Gen AI models, so it's very specific. I guess that's kind of all the rage at the moment, but one is about the development. So if you're a developer or someone that's a creator of Gen AI, then obviously take a look at that. If you're someone that's using commercially available AI products, so in other words, you're just taking an off-the-shelf product and using it, then there's separate guidance for that. And so the OAIC have provided two sets of 5 top takeaways. Um, this is literally them. So for privacy and development Gen AI models, and this is to comply with, I guess, guidance to comply with the Privacy Act. So things like taking reasonable steps to ensure accuracy in Gen AI models, not ingesting something just because it's like, publicly available. So, that doesn't mean you can legally use it to train or fine tune Gen AI models. Taking particular care with sensitive information, because again, with the Privacy Act, there's a lot around consent. And then, if you're looking at PI that you already hold, for the purposes of AI models, but that's not the primary purpose of collection. So we're starting to look at, so when you collect personal information, you collect it for a primary purpose. Now, when you start to look at things like secondary purposes and so forth, it starts to, I guess, create issues, and it may be prohibiting, it may not be allowed to use that without consent. So that's where that needs to be, careful, because if you've got PI that's in a model and it was collected for one reason and now using that to use for another reason, that may not comply with the privacy laws. And then where a developer cannot clearly establish that a secondary use or an AI-related purpose was within reasonable expectations, they should seek consent. So that's basically saying, well, you have it, you're not sure, therefore you should go back to the individual or individuals, because it's probably not going to be one, and seek consent, and also give them the ability to opt out. So that's that one. In terms of the commercially available products, then this is about things like applying privacy obligations to the personal information put into the AI system. So, because you're typically going to then share that with parties that are often outside, right? So, you need to make sure that those probably privacy obligations extend. Um, there's also pieces around privacy policies to make sure that it's clear that, AI will be used. There's kind of quite a lot going on here. So if personal information is being put into an AI system, then again, there's some requirements around disclosure about the information for the primary purpose for which it was collected. But anyway, I'm just kind of reading them out now. So I'm just conscious of time because we just clicked over 8. But I think one thing that's probably on the tip of everyone's tongue is, which one? So if we go back to, we've talked about quite a few standards, frameworks, there's bits of guidance and legislation. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a minefield now. Which one or more than one should you look at? Now, it's a bit of a cop out when I say, well, it depends. But, if you typically, I would look at more than one because a lot of the time they will complement each other. So, as I mentioned before, something like ISO is a management system, which is why I've sort of focused on a little bit. It's a management system, it's an overarching way of operating basically a program to do things like govern risk and manage compliance. Now, if I start there, for example, I can then look at fitting in other pieces. So, for example, if I want to then fit in the NIST AI risk management framework, that will give me that, flexible approach to, address risks, but then I can use 42,001 to build that formal auditable system to govern the whole thing. Likewise, if I want to look at, what type of principles that I use, then I could then look at things like the OECD AI principles, or the the AI safety standard. I could look at those and apply those in. If it's something that's legal, then you kind of don't really have much of a choice, right? Because you need to comply with the law. So, for example, if you're in that bucket of those that have to comply with the EU AI Act, then you need to comply with the EU AI Act. Now, what's interesting is that within something like ISO, that there's I guess, clause that requires that you comply with applicable regulation and legislation. So that's sort of going to fit in there anyway. Likewise with the Privacy Act. So, I always think about, if you've got that management system that's at the top, and then as you sort of step down into it, you're going to have these other elements that feed into it. So as I said, maybe you use NIST risk management as part of the risk management element within ISO, because ISO, for example, won't tell you how to do it. It will just say, you'll go and do this risk assessment piece, but there's not really a huge amount of kind of meat to it. So yeah, I think it's a matter of selecting multiple elements and that are best suited for the organization and the environment that you're in, and then kind of fitting them together. So yeah, that's that, I think. So I think we're on questions, which is good because I just talk for like 55 odd minutes.
Well, I think you've done a great job of it. We have quite a few questions, not quite as many really philosophical questions this week as last week, which is probably a relief to you not being asked to sort of summarize several PhD theses worth of information in a 5 minute question. Uh, got a couple of questions. We've got one from Anderson who's asked what governance or what kind of governance or risk management mechanisms can be implemented to ensure that AI assistants remain tools for empowerment rather than persuasion or influence. So I suppose the question kind of is, do those exist? And if they do, what are they? And if not, what could one look like?
I'm not sure that they're mechanisms. I mean, look, as I said, I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier when looking at what I guess there's like prohibited use. Or am I going a bit too far when we talk about persuasion or influence? When I was talking about the sort of subliminal stuff, and they're kind of almost spreading a propaganda. But yeah, there's not really a mechanism. It's probably more around that responsible use, that transparency, and saying, hey, it's AI that's being used. I'm not sure there's I guess, a specific like methodology or anything to follow. It's kind of more like applying the principles that we've got here, applying the guidance, making sure that those that are, that there's oversight and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, I don't think it could be guaranteed because, at the end of the day, it's entirely possible that that sort of thing could happen. But hopefully, through the whole process of, identifying things like stakeholders and identifying what particular outcomes and biases that you can avoid, um, you know, things like persuasion or influence, hopefully.
Great, thank you. So Cynthia has asked, how could regulators like the EU or US, how will they monitor compliance when this is mandatory?
Um, yeah, so I mean, again, look, it's probably a similar way that they've done it with something like GDPR, right? So that there could be audit, so they could audit as a regulator. You could come in and say, well, go and show us everything. And certainly, like, even in Australia, there are certain ways that regulators, if you're a organization that's covered by that regulator, could compel you to, provide information. Otherwise, often what will happen is it will be the result of something bad that happens, which is not ideal because you kind of want to get to it before that happens. But we've certainly seen that a lot around the world. It's happened a lot with data breaches, for example. So I think what may happen is it may be a case of something very unfortunate happens, and then obviously wherever that happened will be in the spotlight, and then the regulators are going to have no choice but to go and investigate. Now, I know that's a bit of a reactive rather than proactive, but yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of that, as well as hopefully potentially, the compliance piece of going in and doing assessments or whatnot. But I guess the other problem is, when you think about regulators versus, how many. So I guess the capacity for a regulator to do that, that's a tricky one too. So, how do you get the resources at a regulator's end to go and do all these, assessments and audits? Like, it's probably not really that viable. So unless there's some sort of suspicion, perhaps that something's not quite right, um, yeah, I think that's why we often end up in these situations where usually something bad happens, and then it's a case of, okay, well, focus is turned to them. Yeah, that's probably my thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Steve who asks, so in Australia, less regulation means we get faster AI development compared to the EU. What is the approximate percentage? Is there
But
a cost, do you feel?
well, yeah. So in Australia,